Hello everybody, welcome to a very special episode of Discussing Tabletop. As usual, of course, joining me is my partner in crime whenever we're around here, Joe. But we're here today because we have a very special guest with us. We have Peter Mcpherson, who has done some...
Howdy.
You do an amount of work in the tabletop industry and has been working on a certain game called Tiny Towns, which is out now.
Mm-hmm.
So, why don't we just dive into this here, since you're joining us. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself in the tabletop industry here?
Sure. So I'm very much a newcomer to the tabletop industry. I've been playing board games for a long time. My family's always been into a variety of games. And Tiny Towns was my first attempt to really get a game out there and try to find a home for it. Obviously, that has worked out really well for me. I'm just super happy by about everything AEG has done with it and just the general response. So PAX Unplugged 2017 was actually my first game convention. That's when I went to pitch Tiny Towns to AEG and a handful of other companies. So this has really been my introduction to the tabletop industry. Tiny Towns is my first published design, unless you count Temple of Knowledge, which you may have seen the BGG page for. That was a print and play game I did with an educational company. But I consider Tiny Towns to be my first published board game. Okay. And so I'm just always working on other designs, trying to find other homes for them, possibly working on some other Tiny Towns things. And for right now, that is my role in the tabletop industry.
Okay. So you're saying like 2017 was in your first big convention. That brings a question of mine of what was it like getting like that entire going to a convention and trying to pitch something there? Because traditionally when I think of pitching, I think of like getting in contact with a company and then like, you know, trying to go through channels and like video calls and stuff and not like showing up in a way in like a doorstep, like, you know, less like more on a doorstep, because this is them, you know, putting together something at a show.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did contact all the publishers I pitched to beforehand. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't approaching them with my sell sheet at PAX Unplugged saying, "Hey, I've got this game. Do you have time to take a look?" I hear that can work for some publishers. Other publishers can be very opposed to that. So I went onto each publisher's site, and if I could find any information on how they preferred to receive solicitations for game pitches, I followed those channels to a T as best I could. And a lot of, AEG is a publisher that I believe they take pitches over Skype as well. They recently outlined their new pitch process on their website. But it's helpful to have an in-person pitch because you can put the prototype in front of them, and Tiny Towns is short and simple enough that we actually were able to play a full game in my half-hour pitch window. So.
Oh, that's nice.
Mm-hmm.
That's cool. Okay, so that kind of gives you to where you got in connection with them. And were there other companies that were like giving you offers, or was AEG like the one that ended up being like, "Hey, we're gonna like you," that kind of thing? You know, did you have competition for the publishing?
Yes, there were other companies that were interested, but none of them gave me as immediately positive a response as AEG did.
Okay.
So there was one company where we were talking about different possible themes for the game, a bunch of other ideas, but AEG was sort of like, "We like this." That's not to say that things didn't change during development, but they really liked it at the end of the first pitch, which was, obviously, I was overwhelmed. I wasn't expecting to even find a home for this game whatsoever at that convention. I was treating it as, this will be a learning experience. I'll go, I'll learn what pitching is like, I'll shake hands with a couple of publishers, and come back next year. Mm-hmm. So it went far better than I ever could have imagined.
Sounds that way. Now, this does come to mind a question of what got you into the tabletop industry, like what got you into designing and stuff.
I guess I've always sort of had ideas in the back of my head. It's not like being a board game designer was a big dream of mine when I was young, but it's definitely, I feel like I'm living my dream now with Tiny Towns, and I really hope I can turn this into a career someday. We'll see. But I always had notebooks filled with ideas, and I made a couple pretty lousy prototypes in high school and college, and played them once if I was lucky, usually threw them away after that. And Tiny Towns was the first prototype that really landed on its feet. I played it once, with my girlfriend at the time, now fiance, and we were sort of like, okay, this is a game. There's something workable here, and I just sort of expanded upon it from there. Showed it to friends, showed it to strangers, and I've had a really fun time with the whole process. So I did have, I probably had, I don't know, 5 or 6 ideas bouncing around in my head at the time I was working on Tiny Towns, and now I've got a lot more cooking. I wish I were the sort of designer who could work on like 4 or 5 games at once. I'm more of a one game at a time person. So and so for right now, I'm working on some Tiny Towns expansion stuff I can't talk about too much, as well as a couple other designs in the works.
Okay, cool. Now, you had said, like, you always had kind of been in a family that had dealt with tabletop. Do you have experience with other things other than just board games and card games? Because tabletop is pretty vast right now.
Yeah, I did play D&D in high school, and then a little bit in college, and now I'm back into a regular D&D group. So, actually, let's see, is it D&D or Pathfinder? This one's D&D, 5th edition, and then we were playing Pathfinder about a year ago. So, I go back and forth between the two. I enjoyed them both for different reasons.
I agree on that comment very highly.
Yep. Yep, so I never really got much into the collectible card game scene, but so I would say it was mostly traditional board games. I love classic card games too, with the 52 card deck. In high school, my friends and I played a ton of Spades and Hearts and Oh Hell and games like that. But board games has always been the center of my tabletop gaming experience.
Cool. All right. So how about we talk a little bit about a good place to start is, what is Tiny Towns? That's probably the best place to start with before we go into details about, like, creating it and all that.
Sure. So Tiny Towns is a city building game where each player is the mayor of their own tiny town. It's represented by a 4x4 grid, and you're going to be try to make a variety of buildings in that 4x4 grid. So there's 7 different buildings per game, and they will change from one game to the next. But each building requires a specific layout of 5 different resource cubes. And to get those resources, you take turns being the master builder, and there's a little wooden hammer that you pass around, and you choose a resource. So if I say yellow or wheat, then everyone at the table, including myself, has to place that wheat on their board whether they want it or not. And because you can only have one resource or building per square, things get really cozy really quickly as you work on multiple buildings at once, and then you have room to breathe again as you complete them because the resources sort of glom down into one space. And that's the main flow of the game. It goes until your board is totally filled up with resources, and then everyone else continues playing. So if you're the last player in, you get to go on sort of a building spree and make whatever. You can still finagle with your remaining space. And it's got, I like to think, a decent amount of replayability because the 7 different building types have 4 cards each that can be shuffled in, so you never know which buildings are going to pop up. And then there's also monuments, which are personal buildings only you have access to build, and those all provide a different way to score points, a different ability, or something like that. And that's the gist of it. It's from 1 to 6 players and takes half an hour to 45 minutes. It has a solo mode, and it also has a mode using a resource deck that works for larger groups, but you can also play it with smaller groups as well. It's less interactive and a bit less nasty because you have a deck telling you which resource to place rather than your neighbor saying yellow 5 times in a row to mess with your town.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, once AEG accepted your pitch, what was the process like for getting the game together? Like, now that you had your basic design, you're working on it, where do you go from there?
Well, the first thing that happened, actually, was after PAX Unplugged, I played Tiny Towns probably 20 or 30 times that weekend. I was starting to get tired of it and feeling like it felt a little samey from round to round. The strategies felt the same. So that was when I came up with the idea for monuments, those personal buildings. So I had to sort of repitch that idea to AEG when we began development. They were excited about it. I was excited about it. And I was like, okay, cool. Can I add this one thing in there? Because I think this really adds a lot to the game. And fortunately, they liked the idea as much as I did. And then the developer for the game is Josh Wood, who is also the designer of Cat Lady from AEG. And he liked the game. And from our first conversation, I knew that he really got what I was going for and that it was going to work out. And developing with him was fantastic. In fact, he and I are co-designing the expansions. But one of the first things he said was, I like the game, I just wish there were more of it. So we doubled the number of buildings in the game. There used to be 2 cards per building type, and we bumped that up to 4. So between the 2 of us, we were able to generate a bunch more building ideas. And it was about an 8-month period of just iteration and play testing. And we did some playing over Skype, because you can actually play Tiny Towns pretty seamlessly over Skype. You just can't see each other's boards too well.
Okay.
And then he was also the art director, so the 2 of us came up with a theme for the woodland creatures. So, it's Tiny Towns, what about them is tiny? We had ideas from mushroom people was floated. That wasn't my idea. I don't like mushrooms very much, so I tried to steer us away from that. I think at one point we were talking about like small microbes and bacteria, and then we settled on woodland creatures just because it's sort of cutesy and fun, and I was always a fan of Redwall and the Avi's Dimwood Forest series, which is another sort of small creatures in a civilization book series. And then from there, he directed the artwork with Gong Studios. And then Matt Paquette was the graphic designer and did an awesome job with the card layouts. And then we wrapped up development around September, and here we are.
Yeah. So it has been formally released, I believe. It came out the end of last month?
Yeah, there was an early release, April 26th. They did a pre-release for friendly local game stores, so any stores that pre-ordered the game could release it 2 weeks early. And then May 10th was sort of the international release.
Cool. Mm-hmm. All right. So it sounds like there was definitely some development process, some interesting things there. The original idea of it, where do you think you came up with that? Because that's, as you said, you were throwing around all these ideas back in your notebook, kind of like, what's this original inspiration that came up with kind of the core concept?
So I think it came from a couple of places. One of the first ones was this word game that my dad and I like to play when we're waiting for food at restaurants, just on napkins. Each player makes a 5x5 grid, and you take turns saying letters that both players have to write in their grid, and you attempt to make as many words as you can. So it's got that same thing of, if you can manage to make a word using J, that could really mess up your opponent's grid if they're not planning on it. So I liked that, and I wanted to implement that. I wanted to get that same feeling in a board game. And then the other place it really came from, I think, is somewhere between Minecraft and 2048. The first time I played Minecraft, and I assume you're familiar with Minecraft and the crafting system, I was just blown away by, like, oh my gosh, you just got this little 3x3 grid, but you can make an endless number of items with it. I thought that was so cool. And then also 2048, the app where you've got the 4x4 grid and you're swiping numbers into each other. Are you guys familiar with that, or Threes? Similar app?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, so that was the first, like, merging type game I played in app form. And the first time I played, within the first couple seconds, I watched the cubes merge together, and something like clicked in my brain. I was like, oh, this is going to be a puzzle I enjoy. And I couldn't find anything that realized that in board game form. So, yeah, I would say between that letter game and Minecraft in 2048, that's sort of where the idea came from.
Okay, cool. Well, before I get any more questions, Joe, have you come up with anything in here? I don't want to, like, take them all.
No, it's fine. It's fine. You've been hitting on everything I was thinking. So.
I do this
As
sometimes.
usual.
And sometimes I do this. I'm very good sometimes, until my brain actually breaks, and then I reach that end of, like, I'm thinking of something, but it doesn't work.
Yep.
Okay. So, like, without going into details about expansions, like, just you have ideas for expansions you were talking about?
Yep, we have ideas. They're definitely going to introduce more building cards, just because it's so easy to add content to the game through the cards. Sort of like how Dominion can so easily expand just by adding more cards. That means, more permutations of, different layouts and stuff like that. So the first expansion certainly has that, and I think each expansion is certainly going to add a new mode of playing a little bit, a new twist on the game, and yeah, that's about all I can say for now, but we are really excited about the first expansion. We're actually wrapping up development for that right now. We can't say whether it's going to... We're not sure whether it's going to happen just yet, whether AEG is going to take it, but...
You're basically really getting everything together that you're going to, like, this is what we got all together. You can see if we want to continue with that. Okay.
Yep.
Just because it has been released, has it been a seemingly successful release up until now?
I think so. I mean, it's been pretty surreal for me to watch the number of people playing it on Instagram and Twitter, and the number of ratings on Board Game Geek. I think it's been successful. It's been more successful than I ever expected it to be. So that's been pretty cool. I know sales of the first print run have been pretty good. So yeah, I would say so. I've been really overwhelmed by the response.
Okay, cool.
I
Now,
have something.
okay, go ahead.
Now you were mentioning it was easy to play over Skype and stuff. Has there been any thought about maybe like an app version of it?
Well, AEG does app versions for a lot of their games, and so I imagine at some point there will be an app adaptation of it. Yeah, and I think that could work really well, whether it's simultaneous play or turn-based would work pretty easily too. In fact, I mean, you could even do Town Hall mode, the one where you're flipping resources from the deck. You could play that entirely asynchronously, because I could play against one shuffle of the deck and then have you guys play against the same exact shuffle. So you're dealing with the same circumstances 8 hours later, and then we can compare our scores and see who did better given that shuffle of the deck. So yeah, I think it would absolutely work well. It would absolutely work well as an app. It probably wouldn't necessarily be that much quicker to play. A lot of games are a lot faster to play. Like Ticket to Ride is 15 minutes as opposed to an hour and change, because there's not much mid-game setup or shuffling or fiddliness in Tiny Towns. But yeah, I absolutely look forward to an app version. I think that would be really cool.
Cool. No, I was going to kind of follow through with, you said you can get up to 6 players. Like, the thing is, very rarely, but occasionally, I've had more than 6 people. Have you ever thought about one of your expansions increasing that number, or do you think that 6 is the top end that really would work in your format?
Well, you really can just smush 2 sets of the game together. There was recently, I think it was at the ACD conference, there was a game of 200 or 300 people at once using the Town Hall rules. So it's entirely possible using the deck of resources to play with an infinite number of people. Of course, the slowest player is going to theoretically slow down the whole group. But I don't think the Master Builder mode would be extremely fun with that number of people, because you'd have to, well, with 300 people, you'd never see the hammer, most likely. Most people would not ever get to name a resource.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you could play with 12 players with the Master Builder mode. It's just going to be very chaotic, as you have to wait 11 turns to name a resource of your choice. Whereas with the resource deck, every 3 resources is actually your choice. So you have a decent amount of control. So I don't think we'll ever do an expansion that adds, more players. I think you can just buy another copy of the game and smush them together. But yeah.
So that's a really interesting thing, because I definitely have seen board games out there where it's like, to play with more copies is really the core of that, and that seems like if you're doing the wow, you said it just a second ago in my brain, the flipping
the Town Hall mode.
Town Hall.
Mm-hmm.
That's sorry about that. That's my brain sometimes.
I only said it once, so
you said it a couple of times, and my brain should remember it, but it's words escape me. But the Town Hall mode, where again, like that's actually kind of impressive that with that kind of mode and enough copies of the game, you could have like 300 people playing it all at once.
Yeah, and the same thing goes for something like Welcome to, or a lot of roll and write games, or Number 9. I don't know if you've played that one, but Number 9 could work the same way. I just haven't heard of other games attempting to do that yet. So I'd love to see just how many people we can reasonably accommodate in one room playing Tiny Towns. But we'll see.
No, I think that with the Town Hall mode, that's really great, because we've experienced several times on our Sunday streams where we play board games. Sometimes when you hit max players, it really doesn't do justice to the game.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, you can play with this many, but it's really not ideal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you guys could, in theory, there have been a few people who have done play-along videos for Tiny Town, so they record a video of themselves playing with Town Hall mode, and then you can play against them at any time. So, and a couple streamers have done plays where they invite people to join them. So it, in a weird way, it works over video also, which is pretty cool.
No,
so, and that's something.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that's really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's something we didn't realize until very late. I don't know, maybe back in last fall after we'd wrapped up development, AEG was like, hey, there's no reason this can't work over video. And I sort of thought about it, and I was like, you are right. I hadn't thought of that. So it's pretty cool. It wasn't something I intended from the gate, but it's nice the way it works.
Yeah, I haven't heard a lot about board games that have that ability to be played over video like that. So I mean, that's actually something that's actually really impressive that you've kind of like, I guess, accidentally stumbled upon it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's actually really cool.
Yeah, I think in part it's because that deck wasn't a part of the original game. The Master Builder mode, where you're taking turns naming resources, was the original intended experience, and then AEG later came up with the idea for this resource deck, and I was like, sure, that sounds cool. And it's taken off. And some people prefer to play that way, even at lower player counts, and that's absolutely fine.
I think, like, as you've described both of them, I can see merits for both of them. Like, I feel like the Town Hall is much more of a loose, casual maybe, and the Master Builder feels more like that would be like a heavier strategy version of it, that you'd maybe, like, you know, play with a core aspect of friends rather than, you know, the large casual group. So Yep, that's how I feel. Yeah, cool. That's another thing I do really enjoy is when you get a game that because I guess it's effectively, you are getting two games in one then, because you got two modes of play that you can do very easily. So that's really cool. All right, so you are working on some other games in the future. Again, like, you think that you're going to stick with working with AEG, or are you guys going to, like, next time you got a game, you're going to, like, do the pitching process again?
AEG has certainly been fantastic to work with. Couldn't be happier with how Tiny Towns came out, or all the promotion they did for it. So, not that my contract said I have to give them right of first refusal or anything, but I certainly intend to show every prototype I make to AEG, even if I'm not sure it's like a perfect AEG fit, just to give them a chance to say no before I show it to anyone else. Yeah, and there are plenty of games I'm going to design that aren't going to fit in exactly with their line and their style. I guess I hope someday to work with a variety of publishers, but I also really hope to make another game with AEG again, because they've done everything right this time around. Cool.
That does come up with another question that I could think about related to AEG is, how is it like to work with a publisher? Like, because AEG... personally, from my end, whenever I look at it, I feel like it's one of those, like, middle ground companies. You know, it's not your big, like, you know, your Paizo's or your Wizards or something out there, but it's a pretty solid big, you know, you're more than just an independent group. And how's it like to work like a publisher? Because we've definitely talked to some people that have done much more independent stuff, but the two of us haven't had a chance to talk to many people that have worked with these larger companies.
Well, I would say they're definitely a middle-sized publisher, and they have some aspects of a bigger publisher and some aspects of a smaller publisher. One thing I wanted when I was pitching was I wanted to make sure I had creative control over the game. I didn't want to just hand off an idea and have it turn into something that I didn't like or approve of. And when I pitched to AEG, they told me, if you sign with us, you will be as involved as you would like to be in the creative process. I know they have some games where the designer really does just want to hand over the ideas, let them do what they will with it, and then turn out a finished game. But I told them I want to be as involved as I can, and I certainly was. I don't even know how many Skype meetings I must have had with Josh Wood. I mean, really, about one a week last year, and one a week this year as we're working on expansion stuff. So it was great because I had the benefits of what small publishers offer. You get to know a lot of people at the company. You get to work very closely. There wasn't a single step of the process where I wasn't in the loop. But then I have the benefits of a slightly bigger publisher because they were able to produce such an awesome looking game at that $40 price point that really surprised me with all the wooden bits in there. I wasn't even sure they were going to do wooden bits in the first place. And as I was pitching, some publishers saw my wooden meeples that I was using for my prototype and said, this is a lot of wood. This game is not producible because it would just be so expensive. And then AEG saw it and saw the wooden meeples, and I told them, oh, yeah, we could do tiles instead or something that wouldn't cost as much. And they go, oh, no, we love the custom meeples. and they were able to obviously really pull it off. Josh Wood actually designed those meeple shapes, and he did a great job with them.
Cool.
So.
Cool. Yeah, that's another thing. Is that's an interesting question about like when it comes down to the price point. Is it based upon a lot of like that wooden material? I guess is the core of it.
Yeah, I mean the wooden material, the tarot size cards. Again, the tarot size cards was another thing I didn't even ask for, and then we just found out we could do it, and I was like, okay, the bigger the better, because you need to be able to see the resources easily from across the table. So yes, the box is 1/3 filled with wood. When you open it up, the whole bottom chunk is a bag of wooden bits. So I think there's like 136 wooden buildings in there, plus a wooden hammer, if I'm not mistaken. It's very close to that number. So yeah, I mean, I had imagined, I think when I first came up with the idea, it felt like a much smaller game, and I was imagining a $20 game with little wooden tiles. But since they've turned it into this more I mean, it looks like the most deluxeified version of the game that existed in my head. So for it to only cost $40, I think is really cool, especially since it's being compared with games like Azul and Splendor in its weight.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like that's one of the things that whenever Joe and I are talking about a board game, we always like look at like what is in it, what's the experience versus the price sometimes, because it's like the price can definitely be a hard sell sometimes, and like I think like just instantaneously by say you have like 1/3 of it filled with wooden bits and it's $40, I'm like, I mean, just for material that sounds worth it. Then I, of course, again want to look at the game still too, but like at least on a value level, it makes me feel good about that too, because I could have seen them charging more than that for something like this, definitely.
Yeah, here's said bag of bits. So
that's
and then the cubes, and then my favorite component of all is the wooden hammer, which has been called both giant and tiny, and I guess kind of it's a giant game component and a very tiny hammer. So
it's a giant tiny hammer.
That's what it is. It's a giant tiny hammer. That's kind of cool idea that you got like little hammer to gain control. Was that something that you came up with as a design aspect of it?
Yeah, the hammer was my idea. We had just a pawn sort of as the current master builder token. It's not really that necessary in like a 2 or 3 player game, but when you're playing with 6, it can be very easy to lose track of whose turn it is to pick the next resource. So Josh and I were brainstorming different shapes it could be, and I suggested a hammer, and he was sort of like, okay, we'll see. And then he got the prototype, all the prototype pieces, and he was just like playing with the hammer the whole time on Skype, and he was like, I think you were right about the hammer. I think this is pretty cool. So.
As someone that has done that in a board game before, he just picked it up and been like, ooh, just playing around with something, like it's a component, I understand that a lot. Now, you said you kind of went to PAX Unplugged. If things hadn't worked out there, were you planning on going to other conventions too?
I guess so. PAX Unplugged is relatively easy for me to get to. I'm in upstate New York, and it's in Philly, so it's about a 5-hour drive, and I have family in the area. So I'm not sure where I would have headed to next. I guess maybe I would have gone to Unpub. Well, I did go to Unpub next, but not to pitch Tiny Towns. Maybe I would have tried to go to Gen Con, I suppose, although I'm going to my first Gen Con this year. I've been told it's a madhouse, and I can't wait because I love convention environments. So, yeah, I'm not really sure. Maybe I would have just worked on it for another year and gone back in 2018 to see how I could do. So, who knows?
Have they talked to you about on an official capacity going into any conventions like in the near future to like to help promote things or anything, or have they like other than this is a promotion definitely of it, but other than interviews, is there anything like more physical that they would want, like show up here to do this kind of thing that they've asked you about?
Well, I know I'm going to be at Gen Con, like I said, so I'm going to be at the AG booth, doing my Tiny Towns thing, and then I think I'll do the same thing at, I'm pretty sure I'll be doing the same thing at PAX Unplugged again this year. So those are pretty much the only two. It's more a matter of what cons I can get to, and so if they find out I can go to a con, then they will help me out and help me run the table and promote, which I really have a fun time doing. I've only done that once. I did that at last year's PAX Unplugged. So obviously that was pretty cool for me to, a year later with my finished game, showing people how to play. It was a really cool experience. So I have so much fun demoing. I could do it all day long. So looking forward to Gen Con.
Oh yeah, no, that sounds like fun. For me, I do have to say that I'll probably, since I'm already planning on going to PAX Unplugged, I'll have to stop by and say hi at very least. Definitely.
Same here.
I look forward to that. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. All right. Joe, do you have any other questions you can think of at the moment? I'm trying to think of anything else. I think we've hit on most of the things I wanted to talk about when it came to Pete, you, and Tiny Towns here.
No, unfortunately I do not have anything else off the top of my head. I was able to hit on a few things you didn't.
It's true. The question I actually have right now that I just kind of thought about is, with Tiny Towns, you working on expansions, and if the expansions continue to be made, is there like a back end, do you think? Because there's certainly games that are more like you mentioned Dominion, where it sometimes feels like they will never stop making expansions, but they do fit,
Yeah. I think there's definitely a back end. I'm sure there's a limit to the amount of ideas we can get out of this. I could make expansions that are just, here's more cards that work with the base game rules, but those would probably be not as interesting as the ones that are in the base game, because we went through a lot of different iterations for the buildings and settled on our favorite 25. So yeah, but we have, I would say, 3 or 4 really solid ideas for expansions, each of which works like a sort of module, and most of them are going to work together. So I'd love if we could do 3 or 4. We'll see how things go. We'll see if AAG is even interested in the first one, but I certainly have the ideas if they are.
Yeah, it's cool. Okay, great. I think that's... okay, here's one other question then. Since you have did you ever think about, because you do some role-playing, did you ever think about doing anything around with that also?
I'm probably a much... I'm trying to think how to put it. I'm not as into D&D as a lot of people are. I really enjoy it. I've never been a dungeon master, and I'm the sort of player who's like, right, we're leveling up. I definitely know how to do that. Can you help me with every step of the process? Even though I try so hard to do my homework before I know we're going to level up in a session. So, yeah, I mean, when it comes to storytelling and tabletop, I think role-playing games are the best format for that, far and away. And I really admire that aspect of it. I'm an avid reader, so I love stories, and I've always had trouble finding a lot of story in board games as opposed to role-playing games, so I really admire that about them. Yeah. Maybe someday. It's not something I've given a ton of thought to, but it's a cool idea.
That actually does come up with an interesting idea, because you have a kind of a interesting story that you're kind of developing with Tiny Towns, and do you want to expand that story more with your expansions too? Because it's like more of an entire thing. It's like a board game, even though most of the time they tend not to tell like the in-depth stories that you get. You always get some kind of like story to it.
Right. Yeah, I do have a world in my head that exists for Tiny Towns, and I've got some notes on lore. It's tough for theme to come through really strongly in a game like this. We've got the artwork that shows the tiny woodland creatures in their town. But beyond the flavor text, when you open the rulebook, that's sort of the only place we can inject theme. I'm hoping the expansions can at least describe a sort of arc to the civilization. So I don't think Tiny Towns has to be stuck in this one time period. I think there could be new inventions and new progressions. So I'd like to tell a story that way, showing the changes to this world as this civilization learns and grows and evolves. So yeah, I absolutely think there's potential for storytelling through expansions.
Now, and that's another thing, is for some of the other games you might be working on, do you think you would want to use other board games to tell more stories from the same world too? I have seen that in a couple of people that have done like board games that are very different board or card games, but they are linked together by like a common world or something like that.
Yeah, I would love to do more stuff in the Tiny Towns world. Maybe something a little theme heavier that reveals more of what's actually going on in this place. And if AEG were open to it, I would love to make more games in the Tiny Towns world, especially because I think a lot of the games I design are going to be about this weight. A lot of my other prototypes are, learn it in 5 minutes, play it in half an hour type games like this. So I could absolutely see others existing in this world, and I do have a couple of ideas about that.
And then there's another one getting back to it, because you mentioned that you can learn in 5 minutes. In the development, was there a time that you were worried about the rules getting much more complex? Did you always try to keep it down to very simple, 5-minute rules are pretty simple rules, that's the thing you have to say about it,
It wasn't really an aim of ours. We didn't mess with the core rules a lot, fortunately. We sort of stuck with the 4x4 grid from the start and the 7 different buildings from the start, and the flow of the game as far as naming resources has always been the same. So it wasn't so much the rules we were messing with as it was the different buildings and their interactions. And there were some points when we were developing some of the buildings and wondering, is this a little bit too complex? Is this a little too heady for players? Especially since this is, it's made for people who can grasp something like Ticket to Ride pretty quickly. It's in that same weight as Ticket to Ride or Splendor. But we also wanted there to be a bit more complexity for strategy gamers who like there to be a bit more meat to games. So there were a couple buildings where we were like, this might be pushing the envelope a little bit. In the end, we just sort of left them in, and I think we're really glad that we did, because it means some of the setups are going to be much simpler, and then some of the shuffles are going to lend to a bit more nuanced interaction between the different building types.
Cool.
So, yep.
All right. Joe, do you have any more questions yourself, or you kind of handled it here?
No, I think I honestly got everything I could think of that you didn't cover.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is I'm trying to think of any other big questions. And I think we covered a lot of it here, getting into the depths of tiny towns and what you're planning in the future. And you know what? I gotta say, I'd heard a little bit about tiny towns before, and you definitely sold it on me a lot more in talking to you.
Cool. Glad to hear that.
Yeah, that's one of those things, is I hear about a lot of board games, and, it's like, that sounds cool. I hope to check it out sometime. It's like, now it's more, that sounds cool. I'm thinking I gotta check that out soon. Change a little bit of my thing there, too.
Cool. Glad to hear that.
So, I think we're pretty good here. We got most of the interview, and got most of the questions I was thinking of. So, thank you, Pete, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I will have linked in the description when I put this video up on YouTube. I will have that linked below your Twitter if you want to follow him and see what he's working on coming up. If you've got any more announcements that you do and anything like that. I'm assuming that's a good place to see any of that kind of thing.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, and I would say check out Tiny Towns for yourself. Hope you've learned a little bit about playing it, and you folks out there would love to try it out for yourselves. It definitely sounds a very fun game to get your hands on. So,
awesome. Thanks.
Joe and I, as usual, will be back this Saturday for our normal time, normal place here. And, maybe someday in the future, Pete, we can have you on again to talk about another game.
Sure, that'd be awesome. Let's hope.
Let's hope. All right. So, thanks for joining us, everyone, today. We'll see you next time. Bye.
See ya.
Bye.